The rise of Al Capone was not built by one man alone. It was built on loyalty, fear, money, and silence. For years, his empire in Chicago stood strong, protected not just by guns, but by trust. Everyone around him knew one rule: betrayal meant death. And yet, the greatest danger to Al Capone did not come from rival gangs or police raids. It came from inside his own circle. At the height of his power, Al Capone controlled bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and corruption on a scale America had never seen. Politicians took his money, police looked the other way, and judges stayed silent. His inner circle was small and carefully chosen. These men ate with him, planned with him, and shared his secrets. Capone believed that blood loyalty was unbreakable. But pressure was growing. The government was watching more closely than ever. Federal agents could not touch Capone directly for murder or violence, but they were hunting for something else: proof, names, numbers, records. Someone, somewhere, knew too much. Inside Capone's organization, fear began to replace confidence. Raids became more frequent. Friends were arrested and questioned for hours, sometimes days. Some never returned the same. The walls were closing in, and whispers started spreading. Who was talking? Who was feeding information to the authorities? Capone sensed it. He became paranoid, suspicious of even his closest allies. Meetings were shorter. Conversations were guarded. Faces that once felt familiar now looked dangerous. Every smile could be fake. Every silence could be guilt. What Capone did not fully realize was that betrayal does not always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from fear. Sometimes from survival. And sometimes from greed. One man inside his empire was slowly crossing a line, passing small pieces of information, convincing himself it was harmless. But those small pieces were enough to start a chain reaction. This was not a dramatic betrayal with guns and blood. It was quiet, paper by paper, word by word, a slow leak that weakened the strongest criminal empire in America. And Al Capone, the most feared man in Chicago, was standing in the middle of it, unaware that the knife was already behind his back. As the investigation deepened, the pressure on Capone's inner circle became unbearable. Federal agents changed their strategy. Instead of chasing Capone directly, they went after the men around him. Accountants, drivers, bookkeepers, and low-level lieutenants were arrested one by one. Each arrest was followed by long interrogations, sleepless nights, and silent threats about prison sentences that could last a lifetime. Some of these men were not killers. They were businessmen hiding behind crime. They enjoyed the money, the suits, the power, but they were never prepared for a federal prison cell. Fear started breaking the loyalty that once seemed unshakable. A few began to talk, not openly, but carefully. Small confirmations, nods, numbers scribbled on paper, enough to connect pieces the government was missing. Money became the weak point. Capone believed cash was untraceable, but someone inside knew where records were hidden, how payments were moved, and which names were fake. That person did not need to expose everything at once. Each detail made the picture clearer for investigators. Slowly, Capone's financial shadow began to take shape. Meanwhile, Capone noticed changes in behavior. Trusted men avoided eye contact. Meetings felt tense. Jokes disappeared. He tested loyalty with sudden questions, unexpected visits, and quiet observations. Still, the traitor blended in perfectly, acting just as nervous as everyone else. In an organization ruled by fear, nervousness meant nothing. The most dangerous betrayal was not loud or obvious. It was strategic. Information was given in a way that protected the betrayer while damaging Capone. Authorities started understanding Capone's structure, his income streams, and his weaknesses. They no longer needed witnesses for violence. They were building something stronger, something Capone never respected enough to fear: a financial case. Unaware of how close the net was, Capone continued living like a king. Lavish dinners, expensive suits, public appearances with a confident smile. But behind the scenes, his empire was bleeding. Not from bullets, but from secrets. And every secret came from someone he once trusted with his life. The betrayal was already in motion. And even if Capone suspected it, by now it was too late to stop what had begun. The silence around Capone grew heavier with each passing day. What once felt like absolute control now felt uncertain. Information was leaking, and the walls were closing in, even if no one dared to say it out loud. Capone had survived wars with rival gangs, assassination attempts, and public scandals, but this was different. This threat had no face, no gun, no clear enemy. Inside his organization, Fear had replaced confidence. Men spoke less and listened more. Every word felt dangerous. Every meeting felt like a test. Capone began to replay conversations in his head, searching for hidden meanings, missed signs, and moments that suddenly felt suspicious. Loyalty, once proven through violence, was now impossible to measure. The government's case was growing stronger, piece by piece. Bank trails appeared where none should exist. Properties were connected through shell names. Cash flows were reconstructed month by month. None of this could happen without inside knowledge. Someone knew too much. Someone had access not just to money, but to the logic behind the system. Capone ordered internal checks, quiet investigations, background questions disguised as casual talk. He had men followed by his own people, watching who met whom, who drank too much, who suddenly looked relieved instead of afraid. But the betrayer was careful. He never acted alone, never spoke directly, never gave information that could be traced back to him. What made the betrayal more dangerous was that it wasn't driven by hatred. It was driven by survival. The person leaking information was not seeking revenge. He was choosing life over loyalty, prison over death, silence over honor, and in that choice, Capone's entire empire began to crumble. For the first time, Capone felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Doubt, not about his power, but about the people who built it with him. Every ally became a question mark. Every smile felt forced, every handshake felt temporary. The betrayal was no longer a possibility. It was a reality, and even though Capone still walked freely, still spoke with authority, still ruled the streets, deep inside he understood one brutal truth: when the enemy comes from within, escape is almost impossible. Capone began isolating himself, not out of fear, but calculation. He stopped sharing full plans, breaking operations into fragments so no single person could see the whole picture. What once ran on trust now ran on suspicion. This shift alone confirmed his worst fear: the betrayal had already succeeded. An empire built on loyalty was now operating on damage control. Meetings became shorter, locations changed without notice, and even his closest men noticed the distance. Capone watched faces instead of listening to words. He studied pauses, breathing, eye contact. He remembered who had recently asked about finances, who had suddenly spoken about retirement, who mentioned lawyers too casually. Small details now mattered more than gunfire ever had. Behind the scenes, federal pressure intensified. Witnesses appeared unexpectedly. Testimonies aligned too perfectly. Investigators knew which questions to ask and which names to avoid. This was no random leak. It was structured, deliberate, and ongoing. Someone inside wasn't just talking, he was guiding the hunt. Capone considered eliminating suspects, but that carried risk. Killing the wrong man could expose panic. Killing the right one might already be too late. Information once shared could never be taken back. Files existed, statements were recorded, the damage had moved beyond control. What haunted Capone most was not the law, but the realization that fear had finally defeated loyalty. His world was built on respect, but respect dissolved when survival was threatened. The betrayer did not see himself as a traitor. In his mind, he was simply escaping a sinking ship. As nights grew longer, Capone understood a hard truth he had ignored for years. Power could silence enemies, but it could not secure hearts. And once the first secret left the room, everything else followed. The fall did not begin with arrests or headlines. It began the moment someone inside chose himself over the empire. The end came quietly, without gunfire or sirens. Capone sat alone more often now, replaying conversations in his mind, realizing how carefully the betrayer had blended in. No sudden moves, no obvious greed, just patience. That was the most dangerous kind. By the time Capone connected the dots, the picture was already complete in someone else's hands. Court papers replaced street whispers. Numbers, accounts, dates, things Capone once ignored, became the chains that held him. The man who sold him out did not need to testify publicly. His work was already done. He had handed the system exactly what it needed and stepped back into the shadows, unseen and unpunished. Capone finally accepted what pride once refused to admit. Empires like his did not collapse from enemies outside, but from cracks within. Trust was the foundation, and the moment it broke, everything above it was doomed. Loyalty bought with fear lasted only as long as fear was stronger than hope. As the walls closed in, Capone understood the final lesson of power. You can rule cities, control money, and command armies, but you can never fully control human choice. In the end, One decision made in silence carried more weight than all his violence combined. History would remember his name, his crimes, his legend. But the true ending was written by someone no one ever noticed, the one who walked away alive, leaving Al Capone to face the fall alone. Prison stripped away the myth faster than the streets ever could. Without power, without influence, Capone was just another man counting days. Faces he once trusted no longer appeared in his thoughts with anger, but with clarity. Betrayal was no longer a mystery, it was inevitable. Too many secrets, too many weak points, too much arrogance. His health began to fail, and with it, the sharpness that once defined him. Long nights turned into quiet reflections. He realized that the man who betrayed him did not destroy his empire alone. Capone himself had built it on silence, fear, and denial, never questioning who truly stood beside him. In those final moments of awareness, one truth remained heavier than any sentence. The betrayal hurt not because it ended his reign, but because it proved he was never untouchable. Power fades, loyalty shifts, and legends fall the moment they believe they cannot. What remained was not rage, but regret, and the understanding that the greatest enemy he ever faced was already inside his circle, waiting patiently for the right moment to walk away. In the end, there was no dramatic escape, no final revenge, no return to power. The man who once ruled through fear faded into silence. Confined by illness and forgotten by most, he spent his last days surrounded not by allies, but by memories that refused to leave him. The faces of those who walked away haunted him more than prison walls ever did. He finally understood that loyalty bought with fear expires the moment strength is gone. The empire he built collapsed not because of one betrayal, but because it was never built on trust. As time slowed and his mind weakened, his name remained famous, but the man behind it disappeared. What survived was a lesson written in loss. Power can command obedience, but it can never guarantee loyalty. When everything was taken away, nothing remained except the truth he avoided for too long. He died not as a king of the underworld, but as a warning that even the most feared figures fall quietly when the world moves on without them.